All right, we're back. Part 2, the do, the dose. Here we go. We are in the middle of completing the square, getting interrupted by the state of California. Now we're back. So the number we're going to add to both sides is 1. Now, when you complete the square, when you divide by 2, the number inside the parentheses is always the number you're going to use to factor. Always. -2 plus 1 is -1. Take the square root of both sides. You know that when you solve a quadratic, the answer is positive or negative. The square of a negative number is imaginary, and the square root of 1 is 1, and I don't need it there. Some still make this mistake. To get x by itself, you add 1, and 1 can only go beside the imaginary number. They don't get combined together or written right beside each other. So they're just beside each other. Now, we can now write this in factored form. So do you remember the first 0 we found? So what's the linear factor that comes from that? Now, this one's going to require 2 parentheses. That's because our 0 is a binomial, right? 2 parts. So when we do this, we're going to go x subtract, use a parentheses, and then x plus and use a parentheses. So still one's adding and one's subtracting, and we use parentheses for that. A little bit different. Look at it. Not impossible. But when we have a binomial, that means 2, right? Numbers there, like one's real, one's imaginary. We need to have another parentheses, right, to write out the linear factor. We got one more, number 7. Oh, and I didn't write down specifically what the zeros were, right? So what were the zeros again? -8, and then 1 plus or minus I. Try number 7. So even though we have 3 terms, this is not going to be a trinomial because we're missing a power in the middle. If it was x squared, we can do something. We need to create a list. And we need to find a treasure. So I'm going to create the list. So 1, 2, 4, 5, 10, and 20. Are you going to forget the missing power? No. We got that, right? So now you got to find the treasure. Does it add up to 1 or to 0? So skip 1. Does not add up to 0. 1 does not work. So go to the next number until you find the treasure. There's no shortcut here. You got to try and fail. Try and fail until you try it works. And it's unfair that I already know the treasure that works. So you have to keep guessing and checking until you find the number on your list that gives you a remainder of 0. And are you finding the more you practice synthetic division, the quicker you're getting?
Of course.
As you add and multiply across? If you're frustrated with guessing and checking, try that number. Now, what's left over is a trinomial, and it actually feels factorable. Like what two numbers multiply to 5 and it has to equal 4, right? It feels that way, but the problem is because 5 is positive, you have to add to equal 4. And there's no two numbers that multiply to 5 and they add to equal 4. So unfortunately, we're going to have to, and guess which way I'm going to choose? Is I'm going to complete the square. So I'm going to subtract 5. I'm going to go negative 4 divided by 2. I'm going to square that answer. And whatever that number is going to be added to both sides. So in this case, I'm going to add 4 to both sides. When I factor the left side, the number to use for factoring is already there, negative 2. And negative 5 plus 4 is negative 1. When I take the square root of both sides, the answer is positive or negative. The square root of a negative number is imaginary, and the square root of 1 is 1, and I don't need it. The last step to get x by itself is to add 2 to the other side. And recognize a real number and an imaginary number can only go beside each other. So our goal was to write this as linear factors. So can you write this as only linear factors? So if negative 4 is a 0, then it's x plus 4. Here we need another set of parentheses. One adding and one subtracting. Well, let me go back and not make this mistake. I know, you know what I did? Like whatever the number is, you'd have to do the opposite, right? So it's not a difference of squares, it's just both are subtracting. See how this magic thing works right here? Like that, it's magical. And this is magical. They both are not going to be one adding and subtracting, so they both are going to be subtracting. Here, I'll put it next to my magical fan. What am I doing? I'm drying it off so I can correct my mistake. So this is going to be subtracting and this is going to be subtracting. It's going to be subtracting only. So if you know the 0, you do the opposite. Another way of thinking of the opposite is just subtracting. So if one number is positive, you would subtract. So just think of that as whatever that number is, you would subtract whatever that number is to put it as a factor. So it's not a difference of squares. One's not adding, one's not subtracting. Both are subtracting. All right. So I want you to notice that you should have already done this page, right? The next one. I encourage you that if you haven't practiced that page, you should. The very last page, the back, from number 7 to number 12, practices the skill we just did. There'll be a separate video that if you want to practice with me, you could practice with me. Okay? All right, Mr. G Math. Signing off. Over.